Thanks for being here, and Amira and I are delighted to be here with Simon Denny, and we will discuss the exhibition Hackspace. And as Bettina Korek always says, sun always shines on Denny TV. So before we start, please give a very, very warm welcome to Simon Denny. We'll start by giving a little bit of an introduction to the show. Both Amira and I will tell you a little bit about the context of the show, about the way how we grew out of the London show and how we changed here in Hong Kong. And then Simon will tell us what is Hackspace and tell us more about hacking and the genesis of this concept and how he changed it into Hong Kong. We're incredibly grateful, of course, to everybody at the Serpentine, to Julia Payton-Johns. We are very grateful to our extraordinary team. I'm very, very grateful to Amira, the curator, and
Ulrich.
And also very, very grateful to K11. We always say when Serpentine teams up with K11, 1 + 1 = 11. And it's been an extraordinary experience to work with Adrian Cheng and with the amazing team of Adrian, with Carmen and Priscilla. A truly amazing team, and the whole process involved, of course, research. It's very different from an exhibition which tours. We don't believe in this idea of a touring show. If one sort of creates an exhibition and tours it from one city to the next, it's kind of homogenizing globalization. We believe in this idea that when an exhibition goes somewhere, it should listen to the context where it goes. It should change, it should evolve. And that's really why Hackspace changed completely from the London exhibition, because Simon developed his first solo show actually in the UK for the Serpentine Sackler Gallery last year. As always, in Simon's work, he connects very strongly to the architecture. So he worked with the Serpentine Sackler space and looked at management models and the history of hacking in a narrative that is unfolded in a series of new sculptures. Of course, his signature server racks that he developed and produced on the occasion of the show, and then dividing the space really in kind of two parts. On the left-hand side, you had a history of hacking, and it's interesting because it's, of course, a very recent history, and it was Walter Benjamin who once said that it's actually often not what is past, but what just passed. Just past is where amnesia lies. And it was fascinating to see how little we remember of this, hacking history. And Simon really made a protest against forgetting and introduced in the exhibition the history of hacking, and also, in a way, what hacking really means, this sort of field of possibility. And Simon will tell us much more about it. And then, of course, on the other side, somehow the flip side of the whole thing were these large-scale installations which looked at organizational models actually in the commercial sector and also in governmental companies. So looking at Zappos, for example, and also at government communication headquarters, the GCHQ, and looking at how these organizations change in the digital age. So it's holacracy. That means much more horizontal structures and a disappearance kind of vertical kind of management models. Now, one of the things which was interesting when we started to think how this exhibition could tour to Hong Kong and not tour, but evolve, change, was very much, the dialogue, of course, with our partners here, not only with the city, but with the partners, with K11. And Adrian Cheng, ever since K11 started 6 years ago, has developed an extraordinary research with his team into the millennial generation of artists in China. And we could really somehow use this research base of artists they have actually brought together, and also the idea was to visit studios. So Simon and I went on a K11 tour to visit studios in several cities in China. It's something which I do every day, and Amira does every day. Our practice as curators is to visit studios, but it's very unusual to visit studios with another artist. So it was wonderful to visit these studios with Simon, and whilst I had conversations with the artist, Simon drew everything. So the research also produced an amazing new body of work, actually, of studio visit drawings of Simon Denny. And of course, we talked a lot during this trip how we could, in a way, find an artist who would somehow match the work of Simon or extrapolate the research. But we soon realized that what we saw was so exciting. We saw, and I've been to China many, many times over the last 20 years, probably 35 times or something like this. But what we saw, thanks to the K11 research, is a totally new generation of artists I had not met before and born mostly in the 1980s. And we got so excited by what we saw that we first, said it cannot be one artist. We want to invite 3, 4 artists. Then we invited 6 artists, and in the end, it was 11. It was really an incredibly exciting experience. And of course, Hackspace very much became connected in a way, whilst we did the research, to Zhai, to this widespread term in China, often associated with the nearby Silicon Valley of hardware in the city of Shenzhen, which originally was used to refer to a bandit stronghold, completely outside governmental control, but has today become a shorthand for fake or pirated products, something Simon is interested in, something many of the artists in the show, of course, worked with. Now, this idea of actually having an exhibition which evolves, which changes over time, is something which has interested me ever since the 90s. We kind of started it with Do It when we developed the show in 93. When we realized actually that an exhibition, is a learning system. It's very arrogant if you believe that an exhibition knows. An exhibition is a process where on the way, you learn things, and that means that it somehow has to change, and that it has to take new elements into account. We then pushed it further with Hu Han-ru, with the exhibition Cities on the Move 3 years later in 1996. And so it was exactly in spring 96, so 20 years ago, that I came for the first time to Hong Kong. And it was a very weird story because Hu Han-ru and I decided that we wanted to do an exhibition on the amazing, art scenes in Asia in the 1990s. And we wanted to visit Rem Koolhaas because he had done a lot of research at that time on the Pearl River Delta. And we went to Rotterdam and we waited an entire day, but Rem was busy and we couldn't get the meeting. But Rem said it's anyway wrong to talk in Rotterdam about Asia. I'm flying to Hong Kong tomorrow and let's meet there. So Han-ru and I went to the airport, we bought the plane ticket and arrived, in, must have been March or April 96 here, doing the research, with Rem for Cities on the Move and deciding basically that first night here, talking to many artists and architects in Hong Kong, that it should be an exhibition about cities. One thing which also relates in an interesting way to that experience is, of course, the idea also that if you think about an evolutive exhibition, an exhibition which sort of changes and evolve, that it also means that you don't create tabula rasa. Because it's a very strange thing with exhibitions that when we have an exhibition and then we do the next one, we usually clean out the space, remove everything and, do the next show. And with Cities on the Move in 96, 97, we did exactly the opposite. We actually used previous exhibition designs. We worked with architects who had designed the show before us, and then Rem Koolhaas, recycled the architecture. He collaborated with Ole Sharon, who of course works today, mostly in China. We also worked very closely with an architect in Beijing, Yung-Ho Chang, one of the first, independent architecture offices in China in the 1990s. And so it became a kind of a recycling of previous exhibition designs, layering, and building new layers. And that's exactly completely without knowing that what Simon suggested to do here, because we actually visited the office building in which K11 invited us to do the show. It's a kind of a pop-up. It's a well-known office building in Hong Kong, and in the space where our show is happening, there was a real estate office before, and they of course presented the models of the buildings they wanted to sell on pedestals, like in an exhibition. So Simon, when we came here, just last minute avoided that everything was thrown away, because obviously we're just about to cleaning out the space, and said no, he wants to keep everything, and started to use all of these, plinth, and you will see in the exhibition, he restuck them and also used the banner and made a new banner. So in a way, it had a lot to do with actually the memory also of the previous use of the space, which is there, and showing that it's not a white cube in which we do the exhibition, but it is actually an office building. And in the exhibition, there are many links to this office idea. We worked, for example, with the Chinese artist Ajayo, who works mostly with digital media, and he founded a company called Xing Dan Wei. So his company, is somehow connected to Simon's company, is somehow connected to the company who used to be in the space. So kind of fiction and reality somehow blur. So these just a few words as an introduction, and I now hand over to Amira, who will tell us more about the show. A very warm welcome to Amira Gad.
Thanks so much, Hans-Ulrich. Thank you. I think also just to complement Hans-Ulrich's introduction, which is already pretty complete about the exhibition Hackspace, so it's good to know that this is actually, believe it or not, Hans-Ulrich's first exhibition in Hong Kong. And it's Serpentine Gallery's first show in Hong Kong, and this is our first collaboration with the K11 Art Foundation, so it's really an exhibition of many firsts. But most importantly, what's significant about how this exhibition came about is how we've decided to develop our conversation with the artist Simon Denny. So it's been an opportunity to use an exhibition that took place in London and then continue and evolve these conversations that started there and really use Simon and use the artist as a partner to engage with in terms of the research process, but also in terms of the selection of works. The exhibition Hackspace includes 12 artists, and I think it's important to also name them. So in addition to Simon, who's sitting right next to me, we have Zhai, Chao Fei, Chu Qie. I'm still learning. My Chinese is not that great, so I do apologize. Guo Xi, Hu Xingtai, Firenze Lai, Li Liao, Liang Shuo, Tao Hui, Xu Su, and Zhai Liang. And together with all these artists, the selection that has been made for the show is truly revolving around this concept of Zhai, the Zhai phenomenon, and how it does relate or can communicate and draw certain parallels with Simon Denny's work, whether it is about the managerial models that have been adopted. So for instance, one of the works in the exhibition is Zhai, and the work is called Xin Dan Wei, which means one company or one unit. And this work also is the first representation and manifestation of this project that Zhai has done, which was establishing the first co-working space and first co-working community in China. And it lasted for 4 years before it basically went bankrupt. And the exhibition includes a documentation that people can engage and view, but it also includes a certain representation of these kind of keywords that are representative of this company. And this draws another parallel with one of Simon Denny's sculptures that are included in the show. In terms of different approaches that we've also adopted, there is a work by Li Liao in the exhibition, which is called Consumption from 2012. What Li Liao also adds to this show is a more humane aspect of how we deal with technology, or how technology has infiltrated our daily lives. And with Li Liao, what he's done is go and work at Foxconn. And Foxconn is a company that produces Apple products. It has also surfaced on the news for the difficult working conditions in which the employees are put in, but also for a certain number of suicides. And what Li Liao has done is join Foxconn and work there for as long as it was required for him to save up enough money from his salary in order to buy an iPad 16 gigs. Of course, the iPad is also represented within the installation of his work in the exhibition. So this is just a couple of examples of works that are in the show, but I think it's also interesting to go back to what Hans-Ulrich already mentioned in terms of the location of it. It's the basement of a skyrise in Hong Kong, and it's the basement of the Costco Tower, its offices, and the fact that also these pedestals on which each artwork sit have been repurposed and refashioned from an earlier display. And one of the main things that we've done with this exhibition is not try to pretend that it is a white cube. Simon, I think this is your cue. I think it would be great to hear from you about these pedestals.
Yeah, thank you, Amira. So thank you for the introduction, Hans-Ulrich. Yeah, I will dive right into talking about that concept, because one of the things which I was always I'm really interested in the way that companies and organizations communicate their values and communicate what they're interested in, and architectural space is often about that. the way space is organized, the way management styles is applied to people and how they communicate and share with each other. And this idea of hacking, this idea of computer hacking from the tech community, which is one of the kind of areas of interest which I've had for a long time, has become kind of emblematic for certain values that come from valuing radical openness, I guess, that value extreme flexibility, but is kind of ultimately about finding unconventional solutions in a way that kind of shortcuts or does something in a different way in a different process. So when I was presented with the space of Adrian's, which is an amazing building, like right in the middle of the densest part of Hong Kong, I saw this beautiful display that he was producing for this real estate presentation. And I thought, that would be amazing. In a way, real estate is kind of redefining space. It's kind of taking space and using it in a different way. It's expanding space. It's making other things possible in space. And I wanted to take that display and kind of hack up his display system into a kind of a grid. So the show is in a sort of a grid, like that sort of resembles some kind of skyline or street rationalization of space, and then kind of present these other artists' works, which we had come into contact with in our research, which had been really kind of, in my mind, unpacking the core values also behind this idea of unconventional solutions to difficult problems. And I think art is something that does that when it works very well, something that it does the best. And we talked about last time, Hans-Ulrich, the history of exhibition making and how when artists often curate shows, they come up with unconventional solutions to organizing space and organizing material. You mentioned Duchamp's amazing Surrealist exhibition, and there's many other examples of this, also of Cities on the Move. But I think that the idea to kind of activate this space and kind of physically demonstrate and kind of have a kind of a sculptural explanation of what a kind of real hack of a purpose of a space could be, that was the idea with these kind of pedestals. And I mean, when I came into contact with Li Liao's work, this was also something that I thought was very, very interesting, because the idea of hacking being rebranded in different organizational concepts is really, in my opinion, very present in Shenzhen at the moment. So Shenzhen as a kind of, it's the place where pretty much everything gets made in terms of electronic hardwares in the world. Now, people here probably know that, but it's like, it has this kind of cluster of factories, and companies come into those factory systems, like Apple comes to Foxconn, and they share this information of how they want to make these products that they make. And then often, because of the way that that factory system works socially within Shenzhen, that information, which is usually kept really tight within one factory system, will be shared with neighboring factories. And that's how you kind of get this knockoff culture, where you get kind of fake products being produced. And that's been seen as kind of a negative thing. But now that kind of Shenzhen is being kind of rebranded somehow from the inside, it's being kind of seen as the Silicon Valley of hardware, instead of a place where people work incredibly hard for not very much. You know, I mean, that still happens obviously, but this kind of rebranding exercise is being really kind of pumped in different kind of media contexts. This idea of open sourcing factory system has been kind of replaced. So again, taken from the kind of very rich history of hacking, which started at MIT in the 1950s, is being kind of taken up and used to understand the concept of factory and open source in a different way. And I thought open sourcing the process of an exhibition is also kind of what we're involved in. And the idea of sharing and real exchange and real learning, where you listen to a context, you don't take a context as a given neutral space, you engage physically, you engage with people in terms of their knowledge and practices, and you kind of learn in a radically different way. This is kind of the spirit of the engagement with each of the artworks in the show, and also the space, and also the place and time. That's kind of where I was at with that.
Now it's interesting because, of course, the plinth are one display feature you invented, the stacking, of this found plinth. But then there is also the way of installing paintings actually on industrial poles. And it was a kind of a key moment when we visited Zhu Jie's studio. And in an almost uncanny way, it sort of connected to my visits here 20 years earlier, because actually in 1996 we discussed a lot the impact of kind of metabolism, the history of metabolism as an architecture movement on architecture in Hong Kong and China in the 90s and 2000s. And then we were in the studio of Zhu Jie, the extraordinary painter, and suddenly, saw all these documents about metabolism. And obviously what she's doing in her painting is that she's somehow hacking buildings. She's hacking, and you immediately felt there was a strong connection, and then decided to install these works on post. Can we talk about this?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, yeah, when we were in her studio, it was absolutely amazing. And also hearing her talk about, this has kind of happened again and again in this touring exchange, that, you know, the way that I'd been thinking about certain things in terms of space and building were kind of reflected in other artists' moments. And when we were talking actually at the K11 Foundation the other day, she mentioned that like she was thinking about how Chinese buildings that she was painting and kind of deconstructing in pictures also kind of misinterpreted and kind of made mistakes of and did kind of fake versions of metabolism and this history. And that was not actually a negative thing, but it was more a generative thing. So in a way, they kind of hacked the idea of what metabolism should look like and how it should be built as a painting, as a building. And then she, in turn, kind of turned that process into recording and painting and interpreting her kind of experiences of living around the space and living around this building. So for me, those paintings kind of became a kind of very succinct and beautiful poetic exploration of this idea of literally hacking space and what it looks like and what it turns into.
I mean, interestingly, there are different also approaches to space that are being taken within the exhibition, but also different angles towards hacking. So space within the exhibition is also seen as the digital space, it's the individual space, it's the architectural space, and it's the exhibition space as such, and it's the context. And hacking also appears through the works of each artist. We have Li Liao, who hacked the company and the factory by infiltrating and self-imposing on himself this job in order to get this iPad. And then we have other artists like Zhai, another work of his in the exhibition is called Poor Mining. And this is a sculpture that looks at Bitcoin. It's mining Bitcoins. And this is another form of hack. It's a hack of the financial system. And Simon, you were telling me also very much about Bitcoins.
Yeah. I mean, Bitcoin is, I don't know, there's probably people out there who know and love Bitcoin because it's such an amazing phenomenon. But like, Zhai made this work in 2011, and I mean, I'd never heard of, you know, Bitcoin in 2011, like maybe like read one thing. But this idea of cryptocurrency is a very interesting one, which has come both out of the kind of hacking community in general, but also out of the kind of other side of that, which is kind of government security. I mean, the idea of making money transportable over digital space by making it encrypted comes out of the history of encryption and the history of Alan Turing and all of these amazing things, which are sort of represented in the space by this architectural design and this kind of interior space of the GCHQ headquarters. You know, so it's like that's in again, but the idea of the idea that has grown out of Bitcoin, which I find so fascinating, which I think Zhai's work really kind of points at very, very beautifully, is that you know, this idea which has made it possible to have a currency that is not necessarily needed to be overseen by a third-party institution has also made different types of government and different types of management possible. Because basically the idea is, if I exchange something with you, right, if I give you something, usually you need a third party like a bank or a notary or a lawyer to say, yes, that exchange happened, and this, you know, this is going to be how we record that. It's like a document. But what's happened with Bitcoin and blockchain, the kind of code system behind it, is suddenly that's automated. That process of third-party verification is not necessary. It is already part of the technological code. So that means you can do not only currency, but kind of anything you need for a notary to happen. So you can vote with the system. You can maybe make a birth certificate issued on a blockchain. You can maybe make any kind of other process which needs a third party, which is kind of everything, much more kind of streamlined and digitally enabled. So I don't know. I mean, that's just one example of how something coming out of hacking has really turned into innovation, which has gone across the board. But I think that you know, Zhai's work, which has this amazing kind of like speaker system, which is the machine is generating Bitcoin currency through this kind of process called mining. And there's this amazing guitar pickup, and these speakers, which kind of amplify the sound of that process in this amazing way. But it's kind of, we had a nice talk with him about the work, and I asked him one question, it was like, how much currency is it actually generating, this thing? And he says it's generating very, very little. So it's, again, this kind of nice idea, it's making no money because it costs too much to have the processing power to mine the Bitcoin, you know? So it's this kind of nice, I don't know if you guys know this failure machine, this kind of turn off and on machine. It's a little bit like that for Bitcoin, for kind of, digital currency today. So it's, that's another example.
And it's obviously interesting also, you know, talking about the chain, you know, in terms of Bitcoin, it's also a chain reaction. I mean, the whole exhibition was a chain reaction. I always think, in terms of curating, it's something Harald Seemann told me a long time ago, and he said, you know, he did when attitudes become form. He didn't really know at the beginning where he went. So you don't really illustrate an idea with an exhibition before. You go into the unknown, and then it gets more and more exciting. And it happens very rarely, but it does happen every couple of years that such a chain reaction, almost magical chain reaction, sets in. And our studio visits were like this. It's the most extraordinary experience in many years, because in a way, then we started to talk about multiple perspectives of the show, about, you know, your interest, of course, in architecture and in multiple perspective and space. And I mean, one of the things which is maybe also interesting to mention is, I mean, we all believe in this idea that one shouldn't separate architecture and art, but it's about bringing it together. And we are all somehow products of the Städelschule, where I come from, where, of course, Simon studied. And the Städelschule is an amazing school in Frankfurt, you know, where architecture and art were never separated. When I was there in the early 90s, you know, Cedric Price and Peter Cook and Enric Miralles and other legends would walk around there every day. And as a kid, you know, all of a sudden I realized there was also architecture. There was not only art. And the same thing was true when you were there some years later.
Totally. Yeah.
And so in a way, we talked about space and about architecture. And after speaking to the artist about metabolism, we then wanted to somehow think about, you know, an exhibition of many, many different interlocked spaces. And then all of a sudden we meet Liang Shuo, and another amazing, completely visionary studio visit, an extraordinary artist where, you know, in the macro landscape of China, he somehow makes a montage of time and space, which is very confusing. And you were also very struck by that. Can you tell us a little bit about your interest in Liang Shuo?
Yeah, so when we went to Liang Shuo's studio, there was like, there's many things in there. It's kind of like a classic messy studio in a way, but there was this amazing kind of model in the middle of it, which was kind of like a messy, gluggy model, and it was like none of the perspectives made sense. So all of the pictorial space was treated differently. There was like a kind of a train going up the side of it, but it was kind of not really on a track. There's like a kind of classical stepped staircase that leads nowhere. There's a road that goes upside down, and it's a very kind of beautiful object. And hearing him talk about this, he was really like, this is about how this city makes no sense at all, and how it kind of jams everything together just kind of on top of each other. And it was such a beautiful expression of that idea, such a moving sculpture. And then also when he was installing it in the show in K11 Foundation, he was like, he put it on my kind of cut up pedestal and kind of moved it around a bit, and it was so incredibly dusty, like it had kind of dust all through it. And he said, that's right, because Beijing is dusty, you know. It should be a dusty sculpture. And he also said that he liked, we had this kind of system where the electronic plugs were needed to be plugged into a lot of the works, because there's a lot of lights on some of my works and some of the other artists' works. And he was like, well, this also, Beijing also needs power, you know? So you have to kind of take a power cord down to it as well. And I mean, I think that's such a beautiful use of that space and of that idea. And he also talked about it in just linking it all the way back to this idea of Shan Zhai. He talked about it as a fake sculpture. So it's not a real sculpture, it's a fake sculpture. And yeah, so it's a fake sculpture of a fake idea of a fake place.
And the sculpture actually shows a train without a train track that's going in a loop. And interestingly, there are 3 works in the exhibition that represent train tracks. So we have a work by Guo Xi, which is a projection of a train and a train track that's going in, that seems to go inside the wall and outside the wall. And the projection also reads revolution, evolution. And then we have the work by Liang Shuo that also has this kind of architectural-like model of a train without the track that represents Beijing. And we have your work, sculpture, that also talks about the birthplace of hacking, which started at MIT, like you said, in 1946 with the Tech Model Railroad Club.
Right.
And it's interesting that actually both 3 artists are looking at trains and representing it in a loop. It's not about going into a destination.
Right.
And when you think about this student organization at the MIT that thought that hacking was to disrupt in order to lead to innovation, and it's not about just going from point A to point B. It's interesting to see that we have 3 different artists who are truly taking this approach as well.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, the beginning of hacking is such a cute story because it's like it's in the MIT in Boston, and so like they were starting to work with programming these giant mainframe machines, and it was like a lot of work to do the stuff, and they also were kind of having time off there, and in their time off they built this kind of crazy railroad set, and so they had this tech model railroad club, and every time they would kind of like do something unconventional with the track, like put it over a certain thing where it shouldn't go, or stick it behind there, or solve some kind of circuitry problem on it, they would call this like a hack. And then when they were then trying to do the same process with the idea of like how do you program one of these first computers, that was also what they then called this unconventional solution to a difficult problem. It was a hack, and that's how the word hack and the kind of lexicon of hack was born of hacking computing. So it was within an institution, within a government-supported organization, and but it was about unconventional thinking and unconventional problems. But as you say, in the exhibition, that is where that ethos kind of started, and within this exhibition, this kind of train set theme just kind of migrates from Boston to Beijing to New York. It's a cool thing.
And of course, the train, and that, as would have said Kurt Cobain, Simon, Denny, can't complain. Simon, Denny is on a train. But also there is, of course, the whole social and political dimension in terms of, if you think about the revolutionary train, cinema train, in Russia, there is a sort of a strong social and political dimension to this sort of aspect of hacking space, and that is also present in a lot of works. If you think about longevity, his extraordinary installation, and which in a way mirrors his continuous attention to social and political issues, and at the same time Zhai Liang, the instruction piece, how to throw eggs in this content. Can you maybe talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I mean, we saw this beautiful show of his, right, in Beijing, and there was this one kind of watercolor where there's this kind of stop motion almost kind of frame of how to throw an egg, and it's kind of, he tells us, and it's in the title as well, it's like, it's learning how to protest, right? It's a kind of guide to protest, and it's such a beautiful way of kind of showing resistance, because this is like a hack as well, right? Hacking is about asking questions. It's about being able to say no. It's about being able to kind of question systems that work, and this kind of idea of protest, which we all know is so potent right now in the world, particularly in spaces where there's difference happening and things changing very fast. I think to have an emblem of that was just such a kind of a beautiful moment, right?
No, of course, and he also, in talking to the artist about this, he often refers to the softness of the watercolor that he uses and the harshness of the protests that are being represented within this series of watercolor. And of course, this in relationship to Xu Su's sculpture, which are also included in the exhibition, they're basically metallic poles, and we've made a selection from this body of work, and within these metallic poles, in the middle of them are burnt umbrellas that he's included just in the middle of these sculptures, and for him this is a symbol for the umbrella movement, but also just protests and revolutions across the world.
Yeah, it's amazing because I kind of also, in the context of the show, we mentioned this kind of skyline idea, and these totemic, kind of very heavy, kind of amazingly kind of solid sculptures with this kind of break in the middle of them. So if you can imagine like a totem within the middle, this kind of umbrella relic, and then the continuing of a totem, it looks like a kind of umbrella skyline in a way. Like it's really quite haunting. Huh?
And then of course, like with every exhibition, there is something unrealized, and that's the fridge. now it's kind of interesting also, and obviously it will continue, the show will go from here to Wheels in Brussels, but it will also go to many other venues in China with K11. So it's an exhibition which will continue to evolve. Hackspace, will continue. And one of the things we were very fascinated by is the extraordinary new studio of Sao Fei, where she actually works now in an extraordinary neighborhood, which was very important for the sort of early moment of the digital in Beijing. And it has to do almost like with the archaeology of that moment. And it is sort of too early to show these relics and these works in the exhibition, because she's still in the middle of working on it. So we hope that in the next venues we can show that. And of course, here is her extraordinary film with
yeah, it's amazing.
Now, are there questions? It's maybe the moment to open it up. If you have questions about Hackspace, or questions for Simon, or questions about the exhibition. Yeah, we've got a question here. If we may have a mic, maybe if you wait 1 second, we bring a mic.
Can you speak more about that film that you just mentioned? Because that was one of my favorite things I saw there.
Chow Fei's film.
Yeah.
Who wants to take that? Yeah, I mean, I can. I think we can all speak to it. But okay. I mean, yeah, that film is really amazing. So it's kind of like, if I can just describe what happens in it, and then I'll describe kind of why I'm into it. So you kind of get this kind of beautiful scene of rubble in on this amazing kind of pan, and it's obvious that there's kind of construction going and things re-happening, things being built, things being destroyed. But then you get these kind of amazing little protagonists that come out, which are these little robotic vacuum cleaners. So you get in the middle of this kind of rubble, you get these kind of very small, kind of very effective things trying to kind of clean up the rubble. So you get these kind of like robotic vacuum cleaners, kind of in this, I guess, for me, like. Ironic gesture where it's kind of trying to these little robots are kind of making their way through the rubble of a city with a chicken on it sometimes, trying to clean up the mess that is kind of rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding. And I think this idea of kind of destruction and creation of to put it in a Silicon Valley term, the creative destruction of space, which is kind of the hacking of space, that was for me what I really responded to in that video. It's really, really beautifully shot.
Yeah. It's also, it's very much also about this tension between the man-made and nature. I mean, there are some beautiful shots within Chow Fei's film where you see just one plant that's coming out of these moments of rubble, but also the fake animals that are being situated on top of these vacuum cleaners. So there is always a stage tension and paradox that's being demonstrated within this film. And essentially, this idea of destruction and rebuilding, the architecture, this rebuilding an urban landscape of a city, the whole film takes place in Beijing, is also very relevant for the context of this exhibition where it's taking place, how we're dealing with architecture within the space and with these different tensions.
Yeah, and that film is then literally presented on a monitor, which is on a real estate display speculation context. It's like, this is again like an amazing poetic connection to this idea of hacking and redefining space.
And also, of course, it ties in beautifully with what Zhai Fei is working on now, which is almost media archaeology, no? Yeah. Because she's doing a real archaeology of a neighborhood, which at the same time is an archaeology of the internet, and that then ties in. You look at Zhai and you look at the Bitcoin machine, which is also almost like an archaeological object in some way. But so the unrealized part of it is, to show this fridge, because that was we saw a fridge as part of this thing, but and to show this whole research of Zhai Fei, and that hopefully we can do in the next exhibitions. But the video is it's more than a replacement. We're very happy to have that in the show. But there is another unrealized part, Sam, because talking about the whole thing being such a beautiful chain, and in French you would say la chaîne est belle, we already have a next idea which is born today, because we've actually realized that there is another office tower where there should be hack space, because you found out, because obviously you've done this amazing piece on Kim.com. Maybe it's great if you tell us a little bit about this. And so there's a piece on Kim.com, and you've actually realized that another tower here in Hong Kong could host that Kim.com research.
Yeah, very interestingly today, something I found out from my good friend Tobias Berger is that a figure that I've been interested in a long time, an entrepreneur. So I often look in the tech world and standout figures in the tech world. And this entrepreneur, Kim.com, who was very active here in Hong Kong, founded this company called Mega Upload, which then was at the time 4% of the internet, which was quite a lot of usage. And it was used for kind of pirating often and downloading films, hosting things that were often pirated material. And he lives in New Zealand now, which is where I was born. And he was then kind of the U.S. government issued a kind of an indictment against him, and the New Zealand government kind of descended on him and kind of took all these possessions away from him in an ongoing process of trying to extradite him to the US to get tried for privacy and for piracy, sorry. And in this process, it was really what I did was I made an exhibition of all of those objects that were taken away from him in that extradition process. So this became, for me, like the US court and the New Zealand government as a curator, right? Selecting from a collection. So the big collection of Kim.com then gets kind of sub-curated by that legal process. But the cool thing that happened today, and that Tobias shared with me, is right next door to this convention center is actually the space where Kim.com used to live and work from here. So right here on the site, it's again a very nice literal hacker space that used to be there, where Kim.com used to work.
And then, of course, there is also, and that was another extraordinary studio visit we made in Hong Kong, there is Firenze Lai. And that leads to a whole other issue, the question of the body, this painting of hers where you see a body following another body in the exhibition hack space and, in an urban environment. And that leads us to the question, of the body and memory. And I wanted to ask you, because in a way, we once discussed very early in our conversations, actually, this idea of what's happening to memory, in the digital age. And you were telling me, as we move into a period, and I think it was a quote, as we move into a period when everything becomes digital, we will confuse the act of memory with the process of storage. I wanted to ask you to tell us about that. It occurred to me when I looked at Firenze Lai's painting.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that is such a beautiful quote by this guy Kevin Slavin that I came across at a convention center. So another event, not unlike this. Every conversation happens these days in convention centers, and that was a DLD conference, which I also made a work about. But yeah, this idea, I thought that was such a beautiful idea, right? This idea that like that when you take a photo, or you kind of like, or you kind of grab a book or something like that, you store it and you think that's remembering, right? But you're kind of outsourcing the idea of remembering through this kind of storage fact. So yeah, that's a very beautiful space to think about how to remember and how to canonize and how to reify things, which is something that, as an exhibition maker, I'm thinking of all the time. Yeah.
And in relation to memory, it's worth pointing to the work by Hu Xing-tai that's in the exhibition, which is a series of correspondences between artists, between Hu Xing-tai and other artists. And in this, the inclusion of these letters within the show also brings back this notion of time, the handwritten letter, in an exhibition that's predominantly dealing with technology and an idea of mediated communication and correspondences. So Hu Xing-tai within this show brings exchange and this idea of protest within the exchanges that he's doing with different artists, but in a way that requires much more time, and time for it to process, time for it to arrive to the person that's receiving this letter.
Yeah, those letters are amazing. So this was like, he's like, he does these works where he kind of befriends an artist and he kind of gets to know them socially, and the kind of social hanging out is a big part of it. And then at some point he'll come to this idea of making a contract that he himself can produce their work. So it's kind of like, and these drawings, these kind of contract drawings written in handwriting are contracts that he will then produce one work. So that's also, for me, was an idea of like open sourcing the art production process, and kind of hacking the art production process and making it about the social, making it about the exchange. And then you get these beautiful remnants, this way of remembering that exchange as an object, a way of reifying that conversation, which I think are totally
Everything
beautiful.
is a hack.
Everything's a hack. Yeah.
Everything could not be a better conclusion. We have time for one more question, if there is a question about Hackspace, or a question for Simon. If not, then that is a great conclusion. Simon, thank you so much. Amira, thank you so much. Thank you all.